Filipino Grievances against Governor Leonard Wood. Table of Contents. The Wood-Forbes Mission and its Impact. Leonard Wood as Governor General in 1921 to 1927. Filipino Resistance and the Cabinet Crisis of 1923. Impact and Legacy of Wood's Administrations. The appointment of Leonard Wood as Governor General of the Philippines in 1921 to 1927 marked a period of intense conflict between Filipino leaders and the American colonial government. His administration, characterized by strict governance, the reinforcement of American authority, and his resistance to Filipino self-rule, created widespread resentment. His leadership ultimately led to the Cabinet Crisis of 1923, which deepened the struggle for Philippine independence. The Wood-Forbes Mission and its Impact. The Democratic Party, which had been more open to the idea of Philippine independence, lost the election. This setback meant that the new Republican administration was more skeptical of granting independence. To evaluate whether the Philippines was ready for self-governance, Harding appointed Leonard Wood and William Cameron Forbes to lead an investigative mission. This fact-finding effort allowed the U.S. to gather information about the state of governance and administration in the Philippines. The mission found evidence of corruption in institutions controlled by Filipino officials, particularly under the previous administration of Governor General Harrison. The report stated that many government officials were appointed based on political connections rather than qualifications, leading to inefficiency. The investigation revealed problems in the way public lands were managed and exposed fraudulent activities in the banking sector. The Wood-Forbes mission held Filipino leaders responsible for financial mismanagement, particularly for the collapse of the country's largest bank. Filipino leaders felt the report was biased and unfairly portrayed them as incompetent and unprepared for independence. The negative conclusions of the report were used as justification for delaying Filipino self-rule, which angered nationalist leaders. Leonard Wood as Governor General in 1921 to 1927. After the mission, President Harding appointed Wood as the new Governor General to enforce reforms in the colony. Many believe Wood would only serve temporarily before returning to the U.S. for a different position. Contrary to expectations, Wood stayed in power for 6 years and implemented measures that strengthened U.S. control. He imposed stricter oversight over Filipino government officials and sought to reduce corruptions. Many of the laws passed by Filipino legislators were rejected by Wood, frustrating local lawmakers. Wood replaced Filipino bureaucrats with U.S. military officers in important government roles, reducing Filipino participation in governance. Under Wood, the authority of the U.S. colonial governor increased, reversing the more lenient policy of his predecessors. Filipino Resistance and the Cabinet Crisis of 1923. Filipino leaders saw Wood's action as a threat to their political power and aspirations for independence. The crisis escalated when Wood removed Jose P. Laurel as Secretary of the Interior. This breaking point came when Wood dismissed a high-ranking Filipino official without consulting the local government. In response to Wood's decision, all Filipino members of the cabinet resigned as a form of protest. The mass resignation showed that Filipinos were willing to stand up against U.S. colonial control. Many believe that Wood's policies were designed to prove that Filipinos were not yet ready for self-governance. Impact and legacy of Wood's administration. His administration created deeper conflicts between the colonial government and Filipino politicians. Instead of weakening the independence movement, Wood's rule actually motivated Filipinos to fight harder for self-rule. By resigning in protest, Filipino officials showed that they could make independent political decisions. Wood's tenure was marked by conflict, resistance, and growing Filipino dissatisfaction with U.S. rule. Leonard Wood's term as Governor General was deeply unpopular among Filipinos. His strict oversight, vetoes, and appointment of Americans in key government roles fueled resentment. The Cabinet Crisis of 1923 became a defining moment in Filipino resistance against U.S. colonial rule, strengthening the movement for independence. Despite his efforts to impose orders, Wood's action ultimately pushed Filipinos closer to achieving self-governance.